Monica's patience had run out. She stood smoothing out the fabric of her blazer, her every movement deliberate. The quiet murmur of the bank floor faded into the background as she fixed Richard Wallace with a stare so steady, so sharp, that even he faltered. "I need a clear answer," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "Is my business welcome here or not?" Before Wallace could respond, the glass doors swung open with a heavy thud. The shift in the room was instant. Conversations halted, employees straightened in their chairs, and Wallace's smirk flickered, just for a second, into something dangerously close to panic. A junior banker rushed toward them, his face pale. "Mr. Wallace, the board members are here." He swallowed hard. "And one of them has specifically asked to see Miss Carter." Wallace's face drained of color. For the first time, the power wasn't in his hands. "But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one." Monica Carter strode into Summit National Bank with the confidence of a woman who had fought for every inch of her success. The polished marble floors gleamed under the bright overhead lights, and the scent of expensive leather and coffee filled the air. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue pantsuit, her natural curls framing her face, she was the embodiment of power and purpose. At just 32, she had built her real estate development company from the ground up, specializing in affordable housing for underserved communities. This meeting was supposed to be a mere formality, the final signature on a multi-million-dollar loan that would bring her latest project to life. A series of modern, sustainable apartment complexes aimed at giving working-class families a chance at dignified living. She had done everything right. Her credit was impeccable, her financial records flawless, and her company had a track record of success. There was no reason for delays, no reason for second-guessing. She approached the receptionist's desk with a poised smile. "Good morning, I'm Monica Carter. I have a 9:30 appointment with Mr. Wallace." The young receptionist, Lisa, looked up with the usual customer service warmth, but the second she glanced at her screen, something shifted. The brightness in her expression flickered, her shoulders tensed, and the polite cheer in her voice dimmed. "Oh," Lisa muttered as if caught off guard. "A moment, Miss Carter." She tapped a few keys on her keyboard, avoiding eye contact. "Please have a seat, and I'll let him know you're here." Monica's brows lifted slightly at the change in tone, but she said nothing. She had seen this kind of thing before. The subtle shift in energy, the way some people hesitated just a second too long when realizing that the person they were dealing with wasn't what they expected. As she turned toward the seating area, Monica caught sight of the way Lisa's eyes darted toward her coworker at the next station, the way they exchanged a brief, unreadable look. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Monica had learned to recognize those moments for what they were. She took a deep breath and sat down in one of the sleek leather chairs, crossing her legs and checking the time. 9:32 a.m. She was early as always, valuing efficiency and professionalism in every aspect of her work. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her notes, mentally preparing for the meeting, but even as she focused on the numbers and projections, a part of her remained aware of what was happening around her. A middle-aged white man in a crisp gray suit walked in, checking his watch as he approached the desk. "Hey there," he said, flashing a casual smile. "I need to speak with Mr. Wallace. No appointment, but I won't take up too much of his time." Lisa's expression brightened instantly. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds," she chirped. "Let me see if he's available." No hesitation, no request to wait. Within moments, Lisa was on the phone, calling Wallace's office. A few minutes later, a well-dressed assistant emerged from the hallway and ushered Mr. Reynolds inside. Monica watched the entire exchange in silence, her jaw tightening slightly. She checked the time again. 9:45 a.m. She was still waiting. Monica glanced at the time on her phone. 10:15 a.m. She exhaled slowly, pushing down the irritation bubbling beneath her calm exterior as she rose from her seat and made her way back to the front desk. Lisa, who had been typing something on her screen, stiffened slightly as Monica approached. "Excuse me," Monica said, keeping her voice even and professional. "I just wanted to confirm that Mr. Wallace has been informed I'm here. My appointment was at 9:30. Lisa hesitated, barely looking up. Her fingers fumbled across the keyboard as if searching for a non-existent update. "He knows," she muttered quickly, her voice quieter than before. "Please have a seat." Monica studied her for a moment, her sharp business instincts picking up on the unease radiating from the woman's posture. Lisa wasn't just being dismissive, she was uncomfortable. Monica's eyes flicked toward the entrance, where a uniformed security guard had shifted closer to the waiting area, his stance casual but unmistakably watchful. She recognized the silent message in that movement. They expected her to get upset. They expected a scene. She had seen this play out before. The unspoken assumption that a black woman standing up for herself was a threat, a disruption, something that needed monitoring. The realization sent a wave of heat through her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. Without another word, she turned and sat back down, crossing her legs and pulling out her phone, pretending to scroll as she processed the situation. At 10:45 a.m., the tension sharpened into something uglier. Monica shifted in her seat, stretching her fingers as she glanced around the room, her patience beginning to thin. That was when she caught it. The hushed whispers from two bank employees standing near the teller stations. They weren't looking at her directly, but the way their gazes flickered toward her between sentences told her everything she needed to know. One of them, a young man with slick-back hair and an expensive-looking watch, smirked as he leaned toward his coworker. She's still here?" His voice was just low enough to be discreet, but carried just enough weight to be heard. "Guess she thought money could buy her a seat at the table." The other one, a woman with tightly pinned blonde hair, chuckled under her breath. "Let her wait. Not like she's their preferred client." Monica's fingers curled around her purse strap, her knuckles briefly tightening before she forced herself to release the tension. It was a well-practiced move, the kind of restraint she had been forced to master in rooms where she was underestimated, dismissed, or outright disrespected. She wanted to turn around, wanted to say something sharp enough to cut through their smugness, but she knew how that would look. A black woman demanding the respect she deserved was always seen as overreacting. Instead, she let out a slow breath, keeping her expression unreadable. Before she could fully process her next move, the glass doors swung open, and a white woman in a tailored ivory dress and red-bottom heels strode inside, her perfume trailing in the air. She barely made it to the front desk before Lisa's face lit up. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore." Lisa's voice was bright, welcoming, the kind of warmth Monica hadn't received even after waiting over an hour. "Mr. Wallace will see you now." Without hesitation, the woman was escorted through the same hallway Monica had been waiting to enter since 9:30 a.m. She checked her watch. 10:48 a.m. She was still waiting. At 11:30 a.m., Monica caught movement from the far hallway. Richard Wallace finally emerged, walking with the leisurely air of a man who had nowhere important to be. He was in his late 50s, with slicked-back salt and pepper hair and a suit that was just a little too tight around the middle. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he approached, a smug half-smile playing at his lips. He didn't look at her right away, instead adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as if she wasn't worth his immediate attention. When he finally acknowledged her, it was with a glance so brief it felt like an afterthought. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth but empty of any real politeness. "I apologize for the wait. We've been quite busy this morning." Monica didn't miss the way Lisa sat up straighter at her desk, suddenly more alert now that her boss was present. The security guard near the entrance subtly shifted again, watching. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before speaking. "I had a 9:30 a.m. appointment, Mr. Wallace," she said, her tone professional but firm. "That was 2 hours ago." Wallace exhaled through his nose like he was already tired of the conversation. Yes, I understand. These things happen." He gestured vaguely toward his office. "Why don't we step inside and get started?" Monica stood, smoothing out the crease in her pants as she followed him through the glass door into his office. It was spacious, with dark wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The leather chair behind his desk looked far more comfortable than the stiff seating in the waiting area. He motioned for her to sit across from him, then lowered himself into his chair with a sigh, like this was all some great inconvenience. She watched as he opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder, flipping it open with exaggerated slowness. She could see the paperwork from where she sat, her loan documents neatly printed and stapled, everything already in place. And yet, Wallace furrowed his brows like he was looking at something confusing, dragging a finger down the page as if searching for an issue that didn't exist. He muttered, flipping to the next page. He clicked his tongue. "I like to be very thorough with these things, Miss Carter. I'm sure you understand." Monica didn't blink. "Your underwriting team has already reviewed everything. This meeting was supposed to be a final step." Wallace barely looked up, still pretending to scan the papers in front of him. "Yes, well, I like to personally go over large loan approvals. It's quite an investment, after all, and we need to ensure that—" He glanced at her now, a calculated pause in his sentence. "Everything checks out." Monica's jaw tightened just slightly, but her voice remained calm. "Is there a specific issue, Mr. Wallace, or are we just repeating the approval process?" Wallace's smirk flickered just for a second before he leaned back in his chair. "I'll need some time to go through this properly." Monica folded her hands in her lap. "Then I'll wait right here." Wallace flipped through the file at a painfully slow pace, his fingers drumming lightly against the pages as if he had all the time in the world. Monica sat motionless, her back straight, her expression unreadable. But inside, her patience was wearing dangerously thin. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly as he tapped a section of the document with his index finger. "These numbers are ambitious for someone in your position," he mused, his tone thick with condescension. He glanced up at her, waiting for a reaction, but Monica didn't give him one. He smirked, flipping another page. "A project like this, are you sure you can handle it?" The words hung in the air like a slap. Monica felt the heat rise in her chest, a slow burn of anger pressing against her ribs. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way he said them, the way his lips curled slightly at the edges, the way his tone suggested he had already made up his mind about her before she ever stepped into this office. She had encountered men like Wallace before, men who underestimated her, who looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see. She had spent years proving them wrong, and she wasn't about to stop now. Her voice was even, measured. "My company has already completed 3 developments of this scale. This one will be no different." Wallace leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. He let the silence stretch between them, a game of power he thought he was winning. "And you're absolutely sure about the financial viability? I mean, these kinds of projects, well..." He trailed off, pretending to search for the right words, but Monica knew exactly what he meant. These kinds of projects, meaning projects led by Black business owners, meaning projects designed to uplift communities people like Wallace didn't think were worth investing in. Her nails pressed into her palm beneath the desk, but she kept her tone cool. "Every financial projection and feasibility report has been reviewed and approved. You already have the numbers. The question is, do you have a real concern, or is this just another delay tactic?" Wallace's smirk faltered for half a second before he masked it with an amused chuckle. "Miss Carter, I assure you I take all large investments very seriously." He closed the folder with a loud slap against his desk and stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Tell you what, why don't you come back next week? I'll have had time to really go through everything then." The words weren't just a dismissal. They were meant to put her in her place, to make her feel small, to remind her that he controlled the timeline, that she was at his mercy. The way he said it, casual, loud enough for others to hear, was a deliberate humiliation. From the corner of her eye, Monica saw movement in the lobby. A few employees had stopped what they were doing, stealing glances toward Wallace's office. A couple of customers nearby turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen, but their expressions told a different story. A group of bank tellers behind the counter exchanged smirks, as if this was some kind of inside joke. A man in a dark blue suit sitting near the entrance chuckled under his breath. Monica inhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the arms of the chair. Every part of her wanted to stand up and walk out, to let the silence of her absence say everything. But she also knew that walking away meant giving Wallace exactly what he wanted. Her submission, her quiet retreat, and that was something she would never give him. She pushed her chair back with deliberate slowness, rising to her full height. Her voice, though calm, carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Wallace," she said. "We're finishing this today." Wallace tilted his head slightly, a smirk curling at the edge of his lips as he leaned forward on his desk, tapping his fingers against the closed folder as if this was all some sort of game to him. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "good luck finding another bank that'll take that risk." His eyes locked onto hers, waiting, expecting the usual reaction. A flicker of doubt, frustration, maybe even anger, something he could use against her, something he could later twist into a story about how she was difficult or unprofessional. Monica felt the air shift in the room. A few employees near the teller stations had stilled, pretending to be busy while clearly listening. One of them, a young woman with auburn hair, stole a quick glance at Monica before dropping her gaze back to her screen. Another, a balding man in a cheap gray suit, snorted quietly under his breath. Not everyone was amused, though. Lisa, the receptionist, sat stiffly behind the front desk, her fingers hovering uncertainly over her keyboard. Even the security guard, who had been keeping an eye on her since she arrived, seemed suddenly less at ease. Monica's hand instinctively tightened around the leather strap of her bag. It would have been so easy, so damn easy, to let the frustration spill over, to give Wallace exactly what he wanted, a raised voice, a sharp retort, something he could use to justify his treatment of her. But she had spent too many years navigating rooms just like this one, and she wasn't about to let a man like Richard Wallace dictate her next move. She forced her fingers to relax, exhaling slowly as she straightened her posture. Her voice remained smooth, unwavering. "A risk?" she repeated, arching a brow. "My company has secured over $40 million in real estate investments. My track record speaks for itself, so tell me, Mr. Wallace, what exactly do you consider risky? My numbers, or the fact that I don't look like your usual client?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time, the smirk on Wallace's face twitched, his mask slipping for just a second before he covered it with a forced chuckle. Now, let's not make this about anything other than the facts, Miss Carter," he said. But there was something uneasy in the way he shifted in his chair. Monica glanced at her watch, 12 p.m. 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours of being ignored, dismissed, and deliberately stalled. She had played by the rules, she had done everything right, and yet here she was, still being treated like an inconvenience, a problem he wanted to push aside. She planted both hands on the desk and met Wallace's gaze head-on, her voice carrying enough weight that the entire office seemed to hold its breath. "I need a clear answer," she said. "Is my business welcome here or not?" Before Wallace could respond, the glass doors at the front of the bank swung open with a heavy thud, the kind that made heads turn. The room fell into a hush as a group of sharply dressed men and women stepped inside, their presence commanding immediate attention. A young bank employee, looking nervous and slightly out of breath, hurried over to Wallace's office. His eyes flickered toward Monica before settling on his boss. "Mr. Wallace," he said, voice tight. "The board members are here, and one of them has specifically asked to see Ms. Carter." The air in the bank shifted the moment the board members walked in. Conversations halted mid-sentence, keyboards stopped clicking, even the low hum of the printers in the background seemed to fade into silence. The group moved with quiet authority, their tailored suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to the casual interactions that had been taking place just moments before. Employees straightened in their chairs, some scrambling to look busy, others openly watching with barely concealed curiosity. Wallace, who had spent the past 2 hours exuding smug confidence, suddenly looked like a man who had been caught with his hand in the wrong pocket. His shoulders stiffened, his fingers twitching slightly against the desk as his gaze flickered toward the entrance. Monica saw it then. The unmistakable flicker of panic. It was subtle, a quick tightening around his mouth, a stiffness in his posture, but she caught it. A younger bank employee, Monica guessed he was maybe in his mid-20s, hurried across the room, his expression tense. He stopped just outside Wallace's office, shifting uncomfortably as he cleared his throat. "Mr. Wallace?" The hesitation in his voice made Wallace's fingers curl into a fist against the desk. The employee swallowed before continuing. "One of them specifically asked to see Miss Carter." For the first time since she walked into this bank, Wallace's entire demeanor changed. The arrogance, the patronizing smirks, the barely concealed attempts at making her feel small, it all drained from his face in an instant. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, as if struggling to process the information. His gaze flickered toward Monica, his carefully curated facade threatening to crack. Monica didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply watched, taking in every second of his unraveling. The room felt heavier now, the weight of unspoken dynamics pressing down on everyone who had witnessed what had happened over the past few hours. Employees exchanged quiet, knowing glances. Some looked uncomfortable, as if realizing too late that they had backed the wrong man. Others, the ones who had been smirking earlier, suddenly seemed a lot less amused. Even Lisa at the front desk looked unsure, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Wallace forced a tight, thin-lipped smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Carter, why don't we—" But before he could finish, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "Monica!" She turned toward the entrance just in time to see Jonathan Ellis, one of the most respected real estate investors in the country, walking toward her with a warm, familiar smile. The same man Wallace would have fallen over himself to impress if he had known who she was connected to. Ellis extended a hand, and instead of shaking it, Monica gave him a firm but friendly hug. Behind her, Wallace sat frozen, his knuckles white against the edge of his desk. Jonathan Ellis stepped forward, his presence commanding without effort, exuding the kind of quiet authority that made people take notice. His tailored charcoal gray suit was crisp, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his expression was one of genuine warmth as he smiled at Monica. "It's been too long," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed bank like a wave crashing against the tension in the room. Monica returned his smile, shaking his hand firmly before giving him a brief but sincere hug. "Too long indeed," she agreed, her voice smooth, unwavering. The reaction from the bank employees was immediate. Lisa at the front desk sat rigid, her eyes darting between Monica and Ellis, realization dawning in slow horror across her face. The tellers, who had been exchanging knowing glances earlier, now looked anywhere but at Monica, as if hoping to erase the last 2 hours from existence. Even the security guard, who had subtly moved closer when Monica first questioned the delay, suddenly seemed very interested in adjusting the cuffs of his uniform. Wallace, however, was the most affected. He blinked rapidly, the color draining from his face as his brain scrambled to piece together what was happening. His lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. He finally managed to clear his throat, forcing out a stiff chuckle that sounded painfully unnatural. "Jonathan," he said, rising to his feet with an eagerness that was entirely absent just minutes ago. What a pleasant surprise. I didn't realize you'd be visiting today." Jonathan turned to him, his smile polite but not warm. "I like to drop in unannounced from time to time," he said, his tone deceptively casual. Then, after a deliberate pause, he added, "I trust everything is running smoothly here?" Wallace nodded too quickly. "Oh, absolutely. We always strive to provide the best service to all our clients." Jonathan's sharp gaze flicked to Monica, his expression betraying nothing, but the shift in the air was undeniable. "Is that so?" he said lightly. "Then I assume Monica's loan process has been handled efficiently." A fresh wave of discomfort rolled through the room. Wallace opened his mouth, but his voice faltered. His hesitation was damning. He knew it. Monica knew it. Everyone in the bank knew it. Monica let the silence stretch for just a second too long before finally speaking. "Well," she said, turning slightly toward Ellis, "I arrived at 9:30 a.m. for a scheduled appointment. It's now past noon, and Mr. Wallace suggested I come back next week." A murmur rippled through the watching employees. A few exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Wallace let out a forced laugh, lifting his hands in what he likely thought was a casual, dismissive gesture. Well, you know how these things go. Due diligence and all. We have to be extra careful when reviewing certain projects." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Certain projects," he echoed, his voice dangerously soft. Wallace realized his mistake too late. Ellis's gaze sharpened, his polite demeanor now laced with something far less forgiving. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his next words. "How has our client been treated today?" Monica didn't hesitate. She met his eyes, her posture unwavering, and spoke with the same professionalism she had carried since she walked through the bank's doors nearly 3 hours ago. "I arrived at 9:30 a.m. for a scheduled appointment. I checked in with the receptionist and was asked to take a seat. I watched as multiple clients who arrived after me, including some without appointments, were taken in immediately while I continued waiting." She kept her voice even, letting the facts speak for themselves. "At 10:15, I inquired about the delay and was told Mr. Wallace was aware I was here but was busy. At 10:45, I overheard 2 employees laughing about how I should wait because I wasn't the bank's preferred client. At 11:30, after 2 hours of waiting, Mr. Wallace finally met with me, only to question whether I was sure I could handle my own project. Then, after another unnecessary delay, he told me to come back next week." The room was silent. Ellis's jaw tightened slightly, and Monica caught the way some of the board members exchanged looks. Their expressions ranged from displeasure to outright disgust. Even the employees who had been entertained by Wallace's power play earlier now looked uneasy, suddenly hyper-aware of the consequences unfolding before them. Wallace cleared his throat, shifting on his feet as he tried to summon the arrogance he had wielded so effortlessly before. "Now, hold on just a second," he started, forcing a smile that no longer carried any weight. "This is being taken completely out of context." He let out a breathy chuckle, the sound strained. "Miss Carter, I was only trying to ensure that your loan was handled with the highest level of diligence. A development of this size, it's a big commitment for the bank. Surely you can understand why we have to be thorough." Ellis didn't even blink. "Thorough?" His voice was dangerously smooth. "Tell me, Wallace, how thorough were you when you approved Reynolds' loan?" He gestured toward the white businessman who had walked in earlier and was now awkwardly pretending not to watch. "I believe he walked in without an appointment and was seen within minutes." Wallace visibly swallowed. "That was a completely different situation." Ellis cut him off. "Was it? Or is the difference something else entirely?" His tone remained conversational, but the accusation in his words was razor-sharp. Wallace opened his mouth, then closed it again, glancing around as if searching for someone to rescue him. There was no one. One of the other board members, a woman with graying hair and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward slightly, folding her hands in front of her. "Mr. Wallace, are you suggesting that a black woman securing millions in funding for community housing deserves more scrutiny than a white businessman walking in off the street?" Wallace's face turned a shade paler. He fumbled, stammering, That's not what I'm saying at all." Ellis's expression didn't change. "Then what are you saying?" Ellis let the silence hang for just a moment longer, letting Wallace squirm under the weight of his own failure. Then, with a tone so sharp it cut through the heavy air in the room, he said, "Step into my office, now." Wallace visibly flinched. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for some kind of support, but there was none. The same employees who had laughed along with him earlier now looked away, distancing themselves from a sinking ship. Even Lisa at the front desk, who had once sat up straighter at his presence, suddenly found her screen far more interesting than whatever was happening in front of her. The security guard, who had been hovering near Monica before, now shifted toward Wallace, instinctively sensing the shift in power. Wallace let out a strained chuckle, still trying to salvage the moment. "Jonathan, I think we're blowing this out of proportion. Let's just—" Ellis didn't let him finish. "Now." The single word was final. The 2 senior executives, who had been watching in silence, stood up in unison. One gestured toward the hallway leading to the executive offices. Wallace hesitated for half a second, his pride battling with the inevitable, but then he nodded stiffly, adjusting his tie as he forced himself to walk toward his own reckoning. The door closed behind him, and just like that, the arrogant man who had spent all morning trying to belittle Monica was gone, his future at the bank hanging by a thread. Ellis exhaled sharply, running a hand over his tie before turning back to Monica. Instantly, his expression softened, the authority in his stance shifting from one of discipline to one of reassurance. "Miss Carter, I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced today," he said, his voice sincere. "This is not how we conduct business, and I will make sure this never happens again." Monica, who had been holding herself together with practiced steel, finally allowed herself a small breath of relief. She nodded once, her voice steady. "I appreciate that, Mr. Ellis." Ellis turned to a nearby executive. "Ensure that her loan is processed immediately, no further delays. Ms. Carter, you'll receive full approval today." Lisa, still seated at the front desk, stiffened, her fingers hovering over her keyboard like she wasn't sure whether she was supposed to do something. The same employees who had ignored Monica all morning now looked at her with an uneasy mixture of respect and regret, as if realizing too late that they had underestimated the wrong woman. Monica simply straightened her blazer and lifted her chin. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis," she said. "I'll be expecting the final documents by the end of the day." She didn't need to say anything more. She had already won. Ellis adjusted his cufflinks, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling back on Monica. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured but filled with something deeper. "Respect. Beyond processing your loan, I'd like to discuss something else with you. The board has been working on launching an equity task force to address issues like this, to ensure no client is ever treated the way you were today. Your insight, your experience, it's exactly what we need. I'd like to formally invite you to be a part of it." Monica studied him, searching for any sign that this was just damage control, another empty promise from another powerful man looking to clean up a mess. But what she saw in Ellis's face wasn't just corporate obligation. It was real, unfiltered recognition. He understood exactly how badly this had gone, and more importantly, he wanted to fix it. She exhaled slowly, glancing around the room at the employees who had watched her sit in that chair for hours, the ones who had ignored her, dismissed her, or worse, laughed at her expense, the ones who had been complicit in allowing Wallace to operate this way for years. She turned back to Ellis. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "Not for me, but for every person who walks into a bank and is treated like they don't belong. This can't just be a moment. It has to be a change." Ellis nodded, his expression unreadable but approving. "I wouldn't have expected anything less." As Monica turned to leave, the air in the bank felt different now. There was no more smirking from the tellers, no more quiet chuckles from the loan officers who had thought Wallace's power plays were funny. Instead, there was a strange, heavy silence, one filled with an unspoken shift in the way they saw her. She wasn't the client they could dismiss anymore. She was something else entirely now, a force, a name they would remember. Daniel, the young junior employee who had been the one to deliver the board's message, hesitated near the exit, his hands gripping the edges of his clipboard as if debating whether to speak. Finally, as Monica passed, he cleared his throat. "Miss Carter," he said quickly, his voice quiet but urgent. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. I should have said something sooner. It wasn't right." Monica slowed, studying him. His shoulders were tense, his posture uncertain. He wasn't much younger than her, maybe mid-20s, but the look in his eyes was that of someone who had seen exactly how this world worked and was just now realizing he had the power to push back. She offered him a small, knowing nod. "The fact that you're saying something now is what matters," she said. "Don't let this be the last time you speak up. You saw what happened today. Next time be the reason it doesn't." Danielle swallowed hard and nodded. She didn't have to say anything more. She could already see it, the spark of something shifting in him, the start of something bigger. Monica stepped out of the bank, the crisp Chicago air filling her lungs as she let the weight of the last 3 hours settle. The city bustled around her, people moving in and out of buildings, taxis honking in the distance, the rhythm of life continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something important, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been in her position and felt powerless to change it. She thought about all the talented black professionals who had walked into places like this, armed with credentials, experience, and determination, only to be met with the same dismissive glances, the same passive-aggressive delays, the same whispered jokes behind their backs. How many of them had left believing the lie that they weren't good enough, that they weren't worth the investment? How many had accepted the silence, thinking there was no way to fight back? Today, Monica had refused to be one of them. She had made Wallace uncomfortable. She had forced him to see her, forced him to answer for the way he treated her, and in the end, she had walked out, not as a client begging for approval, but as a woman who demanded and claimed what was already hers. She glanced back at the bank's glass doors, where employees still lingered, some watching her through the reflective surface. She knew what they were thinking. Some were embarrassed, some were impressed, and some, like Daniel, had just witnessed a lesson they wouldn't forget. A lesson about power, about resilience, about what happens when you refuse to accept less than what you deserve. This wasn't just about her loan. It never was. So now the question is, if you were in Monica's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have waited quietly, hoping for change that would never come? Would you have walked out, defeated, letting Wallace win? Or would you have stood your ground, made them see you, made them hear you, made them understand that you belong? Think about it. Think about the next time you walk into a room where you are underestimated. The next time someone dismisses you before they even know your worth. The next time you have to choose between silence and speaking up. And when that moment comes, ask yourself, are you going to wait for permission, or are you going to take what is already yours? Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong, because you do. Now, tell us, what would you have done in Monica's place? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up, in speaking out, in refusing to back down, share this story, because this isn't just Monica's story. It's ours. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every voice matters, and every action counts. The fight for equality doesn't just happen in courtrooms or protests. It happens in moments like these, in boardrooms, in offices, in banks, in everyday encounters where people are forced to choose between silence and resistance. Monica made her choice, and today she won. But how many others are still fighting battles just like this, without anyone to witness them, without the chance to turn the tables? How many are still waiting to be seen, to be heard, to be given the respect they deserve? Change doesn't come from hoping the world will be fair. It comes from demanding that it becomes fair. It comes from standing up even when your voice shakes, from holding your ground even when the odds are stacked against you, from refusing to accept no when you know the answer should be yes. It comes from people like Monica. It comes from people like you. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of a time you or someone you know was treated unfairly, don't let it stop here. Share this story. Start the conversation. Speak up when it matters, because together we can create a world where no one has to fight alone, where dignity is not a privilege but a right, and where the next Monica Carter who walks into a bank isn't questioned, doubted, or dismissed, but welcomed with the respect she has always deserved.